Hi everyone. The aims of our presentation today in the context of this workshop is to approach the problem of ethics and aesthetics from a different position. Specifically, the epistemological context of the computer vision pipeline, which, as we will discuss, relies on the construction and mobilization of naive camera operators and naive subjects or annotators to produce a model of vision. And as we argue here, aesthetics here is not the creative domain of the end user, it is already inside the apparatus. So this talk therefore offers an analysis of the photographic culture of the machine learning pipeline with a focus on the amateur snapshot and its configuration as it moves from the specificity and subjectivity of someone's cat photograph on Flickr, its subsequent reconceptualization as real-world photography in dataset discourse, and deployment as a proxy of a real-world scene in the computer vision lab, where it ultimately becomes a visual stimulus for the production of a taxonomy. The question of what is real-world photography in terms of the dataset is linked to the question of what theory of photography informs the practice of computer vision.
We want to address the latent photographic theory of computer vision from two perspectives. Firstly, the relation of the snapshot to the real in the curation of the dataset. And secondly, how the reception of the snapshot is modeled in experimental devices produced by the computer vision community in psychophysics experiments. A further context for what follows is what we call the circularity problem. In short, curation presents itself to platform developers as a problem defined by its circularity and scale. To solve curation, engineers need to curate datasets. And it takes millions of images to curate millions of images. This is a key proposition and an observation which leads us to understand the context of image stabilization and scale, which we talk about here as dataset curation. The problem of the photograph and its relation to dataset curation is brought into focus through Fei-Fei Li's formulation of ImageNet's equation, which she produced in order to estimate her effort to curate a canonical dataset for computer vision. Given a total of 40,000 categories, multiplied by 1,000 images per category, multiplied by the number of annotators agreeing on the result, the time to completion is estimated at 600 million seconds or 19 years of the life of a person who doesn't eat nor sleep, at the express condition that the annotator only spends 500 milliseconds in front of each display. We see here that it means to curate logistically. The need to outsource and consider the process of curation as distributed, therefore taking scale into account, and on which basis this is going to happen. Scale becomes the rationale behind the curatorial pipeline's construction. It's worth having in mind the process of creation of the dataset. Li and her team select a term in a taxonomy, in this case, WordNet. Then they query a search engine and fetch the results. The results are considered candidate images. There begins the annotation process through which candidate images are verified and classified. The same images are verified by different annotators. When there is a consensus, images are included or rejected accordingly. Some useful numbers. ImageNet uses a subset of 21,841 categories or scene sets from the WordNet taxonomy. It downloaded 40 million images, of which only 10% are estimated to correspond to the queries. Therefore, an important work of verification needs to be carried out. 25,000 workers are hired between November 2008 and September 2009. ImageNet, according to Lee, is the biggest employer of Silicon Valley for that period. Annotators are shown screens of hundreds of images. They are paid a few cents per screen. According to the difficulty of the task, 3 to 5 annotators must select the same image candidate for the image to be included. If there is no explicit theory of photography that informs the production of ImageNet, there is one latent in this pipeline. In what follows, we are trying to unravel it.
It's worth pausing to consider Fei Li's 2015 TED Talk, in which she articulated the relation between photography and biology based on her observations of her child. If you consider a child's eyes as a pair of biological cameras, they take one picture about every 200 milliseconds, the average time an eye movement is made. So by the age of 3, a child would have hundreds of millions of pictures of the world. That's a lot of training examples. So instead of focusing on solely better and better algorithms, my insight was to give the algorithms the kind of training data that a child was given by experiences in both quantity and quality. What's important to recognize here is that vision is conflated with the technical apparatus of the camera, in which processes of mediation are rendered transparent and unproblematic. And what's interesting, of course, is this idea finds its way into the iconography used by Lee's own computer lab. Of course, Lee's proposition is to move beyond the existing photographic culture of computer vision, embodied in the object of the dataset, which has its own genealogy, but relied heavily on sourcing large quantities of high-quality photographs, leading to an over-reliance on professional photography, as in the Ferret dataset, and collections of stock photography, such as the canonical Coral CDs pictured here. From this perspective, whilst this offers a convenient source of imagery with its own taxonomy, it does not escape what she sees as the bias of the photographer. It is far from a natural source of imagery reflective of the diversity and scale of samples required from an offline, controlled, and contained source. In computing science literature, the Flickr snapshot soon became embraced and positioned as a descriptive and largely transparent image of the world, which in its vast aggregation of lighting, subjects, and framing offers to overcome the limits of professional photographs or those made in the lab. And as we see in this slide, Flickr becomes the source of many canonical datasets from the last decade. As Fei Li and colleagues suggest, although everyone has a bias when taking a picture, we believe that the large number of images from different unknown sources would help average out these biases, which she said in 2007. So Flickr becomes a stand-in for what is called in the literature real-world photography, or even real-world scene, as we see here, in this reference to the Yahoo Flickr dataset. However, what is this real-world photography that computer scientists curate? The availability of ImageNet and datasets relying on the same source makes it possible to bypass this question, as it is already answered in the object. It's already baked into the dataset. And of course, Flickr is intimately connected to the new revived creative agency of the amateur photographer under Web 2, which in turn finds its way into narratives in the computing science literature. This is quite unsurprising because, of course, the amateur photographer is someone who does not work for financial reasons, is motivated by their passion, and produces snapshots, a term which emerges in tandem with the production of the box brownie in the 20th century, which simplified photography further through semi-automated features. So the snapshot becomes both devalued as a cultural form for its sameness, its banality, its everyday aesthetics, yet valorized for its absence of artfulness. And as we see here in this quote from Aperture's 1976 issue, where the artist Lisette Model heralds the snapshot as both spontaneous and innocence, and directly positions it in opposition to that of the bias of the professional. And so in cannibalizing the naive realism of the unstylized snapshot, the dataset can, as a cache of networked images, be camouflaged as a non-political, non-significant and non-ideological site that does not merit textual analysis. And of course, the wild scales of the Flickr snapshot promises to cure the dataset of its representative, but not representational bias. A collection of 10,000 photos of sunsets, cats, clocks, or clouds possess the statistical variance and iconic unity which is required of the dataset. But perhaps most significantly, the naive snapshot offers the potential to bypass the cognizance of the camera operator, which might prejudice a truthful representation. And as we see here, the automatism of the camera, which produces the spontaneous snapshot, is positioned at that which renders a truthful and transparent image of the world in a millisecond's exposure. And it's perhaps not surprising then that the Flickr feed of Andy Nystrom of Canada, shown here, is a major contributor to the Yahoo Flickr Creative Commons 1000 million dataset, and the only photographer to be credited in its associated paper. So now we reach a situation where the amateur snapshot is computationally valorized for its statistical variation, whilst culturally derided for its embrace of repetitive banalities. The amateur photographer is the producer of cliches, but also a gateway to an imaginary real which can be grasped through scale and variation. The snapshot possesses an unconstrained automatism required of the dataset, in which the quotidian, habitual, ambient production of images by naive photographers have the capacity to capture the long tail of cultural production and, by extension, the real. The bias of the photograph which the machine vision researcher must contend with is limited to its statistical variability, in which the wild scale of Flickr's real-world photography is set against the staid conventions of the professional photographic studio. Bias is not understood here in terms of the politics of photographic representation or the subjectivity of the photographer, both which have been rendered invisible. Instead, it's a calculable property in which the framing of a single cat photograph might be obliterated or absorbed into the generality produced by the semi-automated or compulsive output of millions of cat photographers. Of course, there is more to this story, as the photograph enters the environment of annotation, where the naive amateur photographer becomes continuous with what is then termed the naive viewer or annotator.
To move on to the later part of the pipeline, let's go back to the ImageNet's equation introduced earlier. As we said, the condition to complete the annotation in time is that the annotator only spends 500 milliseconds in front of each display. Or in these words, we measure precision as the fraction of worker reactions that were within 500 milliseconds of a positive cue. But where do these 500 millisecond heuristics come from? The optimization of dataset curation goes alongside experiments studying biology and vision. Lee and colleagues are interested in a certain speed of vision connected to a particular level of description they call the basic categories. Research on human vision is conducted in parallel to the creation of datasets. Fei-Fei Li designed a particularly interesting experiment while creating ImageNet. The experimental protocol can be summarized the following way. 22 students from the California Institute of Technology proficient in English are recruited. The subjects are naive about the purpose of the experiment. They are cued before an image for a very short time, from 27 to 500 milliseconds. They are given unlimited time to write a description of what they just perceived. Following this procedure, 1,980 descriptions are produced. In the experiment, the study of perception is inherently bound to an apparatus of classification, the taxonomy. To process the results, the research team constructs a standardized and hierarchical list of 105 attributes based on the descriptions. The researchers match display times and levels of descriptions. In her work, Fei-Fei Li, whom I'm borrowing a slide in her presentation of the production of ImageNet, describes her work as operationalizing Roche theory. Fei-Fei Li models the expected behavior of the annotator, making heavy use of Eleanor Roche's theory of classification and her concept of basic categories in particular. According to Roche, we tend to choose basic categories such as dog and cat because they allow for a strong differentiation from their parent. For instance, dog and cat as categories are very different than domestic animal in what they allow to distinguish. And because the difference between dog and cat offers also a more immediate contrast than the difference between their subcategories. For instance, the difference between breeds of dogs or breeds of cats. Further, basic categories correspond to an economic optimum. They are the categories that require the least effort to reach. To reach a more abstract level or to access a finer grained class requires additional effort. In this respect, all levels do not have the same inclusive quality. Other levels than basic categories require extra work with lower information gain. In their experiments, Li and colleagues are attempting to locate perceptual thresholds by increasing display times by small increments. They correlate levels of description to display times. They become able to calculate how much time they need to give a subject to describe an image at a given level of abstraction. Shapes and colors need 27 milliseconds to 40 milliseconds. Generic categories such as table and chair appear below 100 milliseconds, and basic categories such as father or laptop require half a second. The model of vision is one of incipient perception, where time is the discriminating factor. The experiment offers a model of vision where subjects are engaged in incipient perception, a moment of perception where sensation and cognition are in immediate relation. Incipient perception is categorial and can be mapped on basic categories, the level of abstraction at which stimuli offer the highest form of clue validity. The privileged provider of basic category in visual form is the snapshot. There is a privileged level at which the world welcomes perceiving subjects and where these notions offer a stable conceptual ground. Here, an apple, a dog, a microwave are concepts that can be detected and labeled without resorting to sophisticated reasoning. This is the level at which the world can be perceived and shared consensually. The experimental work produced a synthesis. It's not a matter of merely images, it's about forming an assemblage. To conclude, first and foremost, we want to emphasize the account of the whole process of machine vision. There are several latent theories which are related to the aesthetics of machine vision. A theory of photography, a theory of vision, a theory of classification. They are not discussed and not visible to engineers, but they are embedded in the environment of annotation and the sources of images. So in order to discuss them, they need to be traced back.
This, we propose, is the problem with Lee's latent theory of photography. It collapses on the same plane the cultural, the technological, and the biological. As it is in denial of photographic mediation, it cannot anticipate the complexity of the image world, and therefore can only react post hoc when problems emerge, e.g., the mainstreaming of ImageNet. As it is in denial of the labour underlying photographic production and dataset annotation, it will leave unquestioned how photography is made to be data in the first place. It remains blind to the performative role of the methods, the labour, the agents, the scales, the apparatuses, and the alignments it relies on. In its embrace of the amateur snapshot, the photographic pipeline of machine vision is camouflaged as non-political, non-significant, and non-ideological sight that does not merit critical analysis. And here we end with a reference to some of the texts that today's paper draws upon, if you're interested in reading further, and we welcome any questions. Thank you.